Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for everyone for joining us for the Climate Change and Building Resilient Communities discussion. Today, we are honored to bring two brilliant minds on the subject, Sandra Begay and Sherry Stout. Sandra is a member of the Navajo Nation and the daughter of a Navajo tribal leader and a public health nurse. She has been an engineer for 33 years and has worked at the Sandia National Laboratories for 30 years, where she is a researcher and development engineer. Before Sandia, Sandra worked at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and Los Alamos National Laboratory. Sandra has enjoyed 20 years of unique work focusing on providing technical assistance to tribes across the US. Sandra is proud to have mentored 44 technical American Indian and Alaska Native college students, which include 26 women interns, and former interns have become highly regarded technical staff members and leaders within their tribal organizations, industries, academia, and nonprofit groups. Sandra, it is an honor to have you, so thank you for supporting MTERA. We also have Sherry Stout joining us today. Sherry is the Arctic Strategic Program Manager and the Senior Research Engineer at NREL's Cold Climate Housing Research Center. Her research primarily focuses on resilient energy transition at multiple jurisdiction scales. This includes leading climate change and resilient assessments, integrated energy transition analysis, and planning in rural, remote, and islanded communities, and researching the interaction of social science and infrastructure resilience. She has built or led multiple technical assistance programs and projects at NREL to serve a diverse group of stakeholders ranging from American Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages to international governments and federal agencies. She is keenly interested in finding ways to better enable partners, governments, and stakeholders to achieve their energy goals through delivery of technical expertise. So welcome, Sandra and Sherry. We thank you again for participating. Sandra will be presenting first, and we will be having a Q&A session directly after her presentation. Please use the chat box to introduce yourself and communicate with other attendees. But if you have formal questions for one of the panelists, please enter it in the Q&A feature. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. I'm just excited that we're able to offer a little bit of insight to supporting your tribes, your communities with their goals for building resiliency. Formally, Yate, my name is Sandra Begay. I'm a member of the Nanash-Deza Chutchitney clan, the Zuni clan of the Navajo, and I was born as a gift to the Twitachitney or Bitterwater clan. I grew up in Gallup, New Mexico, and have spent most of my professional career as an engineer, mostly in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I wanted to thank again the group that's brought all of you together today. I think what's fascinating about the last 2 years is that the attention being given to communities that have goals that they want to support with energy resilience and also climate change measures is at a heightened level. So for my work, working at a national lab at Sandia in Albuquerque, I'm being called upon from various programs throughout the laboratory to understand what the communities need as far as engagement, how to best support them with technical assistance. I'll just give you some very specifics. We are able to give quick 40 hours of technical assistance from Sandia Labs that's really support something unique for your community. It's offered by the Department of Energy's Office of Indian Energy. That's my main sponsor of the technical assistance work. One of the things that we've done in the past, and I hope we get to do in the future, is strategic energy planning with communities. It's a very unique way of going through what businesses sometimes go through, SWOT analysis, strengths, weakness, opportunity, threats, looking at a vision, looking where you want to go for the future, looking at the strategies and action plans. But part of the work that we have done through Sandia and has been mainly sponsored by the Indian Energy Office out of the Department of Energy has been focused in on getting as many community members to be a part of the session. We have been able to not give a workshop, it's really a work session that we use 3 days to get the community's input. And we are very cognizant to have the community really invite a broad brush of people who could be a part of that vision. The more grassroots, the more community building in a session such as that is very key to having a great plan, and one that people will have passion for and step up to take on a lot of these initiatives. I think that's one way to go about a community understanding what to do next. It's really developing maybe a horizon of 10 years where you want to go, what your resources are, to be able to understand how do you then move that forward. And with traditional business type of strategies, it's the sessions we pull together are a little bit different because we constantly keep the voice of the community through consensus building as this 3-day session progresses. So that's one avenue we've been able to help out with. The other avenue that I think for me is more exciting about, trying to grow young people is the internship that I've been a part of for 20 years. The numbers you heard are a little outdated, but we restarted the internship program this year. I currently have 2 graduate students. I'm in the middle of hiring 3 full-time students this summer, and then we'll have 3 year-round graduate interns this next fall. What's unique about this is we take students who are already decided that the science, technology, engineering, and math fields are something they have a very great interest, and we look at how do we complement what they've studied in school by getting them what they sometimes we call it boots on the ground, or diving into the deep end of projects. I take them out into the field with tribes that we've had some great work with, and let the students understand from the project manager at the tribe, how did you get this project done? What were the challenges that faced you? Really, I'm not the filter that tells the story. It's the tribal project managers, the energy leaders, the environmental protection folks, and sometimes even some tribal leaders will interact with the students, explaining why their wind farm is so successful, why their solar array is just one of many that they put in, the plans for putting in a microgrid, really looking at where they're advancing some of the hardware that's necessary for renewable energy development. I think where the students come from is really knowing academically, studying it, and being very sure of processes and the way you approach projects. Maybe for my example, as an engineer, project management was my background, but really understanding from the tribe, what did it take to overcome some of the challenges that are unique to Indian country? And many of you know this, it's getting buy-in from the leadership, having consistency with that buy-in over different elections, having the passion for this project that beyond whatever may not work out as well as far as timing, that you stick with it. And this notion of a champion is something that my students, interns are very interested in. And a person, how do you get through all of those potholes, bumps in the road to be able to get your projects put in place? I'll just tell you a couple of examples that I think the students are really keyed into. You may have heard from Tommy Jones, who now works with Lizanna Pierce out of the DOE Indian Energy Office. And Tommy worked on his dissertation at a level that really was unique in looking at what the tribes were facing from big and large projects that they were putting into place. They were looking at the barriers of where renewable energy development was, hitting some roadblocks, and using the real interesting analysis to be able to understand how do you support a tribe to get beyond these hurdles that they'd have to go through. And with such unique research, I think what's good about our interns and students is that they can take the time to document some of the progress that a tribe has made. This is beyond like reporting on your grant. This is more of the story. What was the inside of the success of a project? I'll tell you one example of a tribe in Southern California that I've been watching and just really am very excited about what they did is the Campo tribe in Southern California and their wind farm. The elements for their success was the willingness of the tribe, the natural resources. They have a very rocky terrain where there's not much development that can be done because of that landscape, mountainous and severely impeded by rocks. But as they said, that was an asset to them historically, being pushed into the mountains, that this wind resource was something that the tribe could tap into. They had transmission lines available. They had a customer in the San Diego area that had an appetite for renewable energy, and that they decided to do a lease model. So they leased their land to a wind developer, and they're really glad that they put that wind farm on their tribal lands. They added a single wind turbine for their casino. So when the students go out to go see these projects, they get to talk to the project manager and also talk to the wind operator. We look inside the wind turbine and look at how big these wind turbines are. So that's sort of that hands-on aspect that I really enjoy, trying to showcase different tribal projects. Another project on this same type of geographical area is out at Agua Caliente, which is in Palm Springs. They have a traditional trading post that is at the front canyons of a hiking trail for them. And they had decided culturally and for their tribe, they didn't want to run lines and poles into this very beautiful vista. So the trading post that they have, they got Department of Interior money to put in solar panels and batteries to give electricity to that trading post, because they didn't want to have the grid come up to that beautiful vista. And so the students go there and learn all about how did you put this in. They've got steep cliffs. So really the interesting part of this project is the solar day they have to plan for is in the winter, when they have very little sun and it could be cloudy for a number of days in a row. So that are some interesting natural barriers that they had to design for to be able to have this trading post powered in very minimal sun, which is for them in the winter. The others, the students are traveling in the summer. So we're in Palm Springs when it hit 120 degrees during one of our visits. So even having them experience that there's tribes that have such extremes in climate, to see how they are managing some of their energy. And they have an array on one of their municipal buildings for the tribe that powers and tries to sell any excess to the city of Palm Springs. So just a couple of examples on how I've been able to have interns or students learn about these projects. I think the other plus is what I mentioned at the beginning is, I think there's going to be some opportunities for energy planning that will be coming forward. So if you're at that stage as a tribe trying to organize where you want to go, I think that's something to keep in mind. Usually it's a set number of days in a row. And for the teams that have gone out to do this energy planning, we go to your location, we go into the community so that we can get as many participants as possible and stick with it within those days to get it started, and at the end, maybe even an action plan, maybe even a 90-day action plan. So I've seen the success of those type of projects. Just a couple of examples I wanted to leave who have done that energy planning. Small village in Alaska near the Arctic Circle. We went through a planning process with them. I went to Alaska to their village, flew in, stayed there for about 4 or 5 days, and we just stuck with it, trying to get that plan with the community's buy-in. And years later, I keep hearing about the new pieces of equipment that they're putting in place because their goals were to have more renewable energy in their village. I think the other is a long-term customer that's had strategic planning is the Forest County Potawatomi. They use the facilitators that we've used at Sandia, and they were able to pull together their community-based plan to understand where they're headed for the future. And the other, just to keep in mind, is to think about how you might have some baseline metrics that you start off with that you can then compare in the future when you have projects going forward, or if it matches the goals that you want to do, and just keep that in mind as far as metrics. So Charlie, I can talk a little bit more, but I wanted to leave some time for questions if there's some that you'd like to move forward.
If you're ready for questions, then let's move for that. And let's see, I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment. We'll let people chime in if they're able to in the chat.
Sure, Charlie, I see a question from Moa. I hope I got your name right. I'm sorry if I didn't get it right. You're looking for the PhD thesis roadblocks in renewable energy project. Yes, that's on the DOE Indian Energy website, if you look at interns, you'll see a listing of all the interns and their papers that have been published through Sandy and are on the DOE Indian Energy website. How often is the internship? Well, we didn't have one in 2020, and I just restarted this year. So I do have year-round interns, those who want to work part-time, and then this summer, 3 full-time for the summer interns. And what's unique about this summer is we're offering it virtually, and we're all becoming virtual workers. So I'm hoping if things open up that we can all travel together as a group and go see a couple of projects. So the past, we would be traveling a lot in the summer to get to different installations to understand what's happening in Indian country, and then have students really focus a paper from the summer experience to then maybe write down what they'd like to see as future development. I'll mention one of my interns, Terry Allery from the Turtle Mountain Chippewa tribe. She now works at a tribal college there in the state. She is a civil engineer with her master's degree, and she wrote a paper on how to put in some solar lights along a roadway on their tribal lands that has a lot of traffic accidents because it's very, very dark. There are no street lights, and compared putting in solar type street lights versus conventional, and the price difference was huge. So I think, you know, having the time of an intern, of a student, to answer a question that helps a community's need and putting in renewable energy projects is a plus, because they have the time and it's of their academic research to put together such a paper. And so I can see that's going to be offered every year. As far as I can see, the Department of Energy's director is very excited about the internship program. So I think that's a big plus for the program. There you go. You have Tommy Jones's paper in the chat. And thank you for all of you who have put together your who you are and where you're from. Is there a case study for establishing a network of solar microgrids using already constructed parking lots and existing buildings? Yes, so there's quite a few of the projects that you can look up on the Department of Energy's Indian Energy pages. So any tribe who receives hardware grants from the federal agency has to do a report. There's usually PowerPoints that are presented, and there's also recordings of the yearly annual peer review where all the tribes who receive grants report to the DOE Indian Energy office. And it's 4 days worth of presentations. So I would look through the listing and look at which tribes put in microgrids, and then you can listen to their presentation. They've been doing it virtually for 2 years, so some great recordings that are available. Charlie, do you have any other questions?
I don't see any other questions.
I appreciate anybody's chance to ask me. And let me put this in the chat. This is my email address, so you can send me more information, ask more questions beyond our workshop today. As you can probably tell, I enjoy my job. It's been 20 years to be able to work for this particular office. It used to be called the Tribal Energy Program. Now, with the 2005 Energy Policy Act, it now is an office on its own called the Office of Indian Energy. And hopefully you had a representative earlier this day. Last thing I wanted to remind you, there are 2 offices of Indian Energy. There's one that I've talked about that's my main sponsor, that's in the Department of Energy, and then the other is the Department of Interior, out of the Energy and Minerals Department, has an Indian Energy office. So 2 different approaches. Let me give you that last insight while I have a few minutes. DOE, with their funding opportunities called a FOA, F-O-A, Funding Opportunity Announcement, very rigorous, follow all the questions, a lot of paperwork. Takes a while to get the application done, try not to do it the last minute, and then you submit. Then it's reviewed by a technical panel, and then the federal officer selects from those that have been peer reviewed. Department of Interior, very different. It's more of a trustee role where you can call them up give them ideas. They'll say, well, we got this opportunity coming up. Think about this. Why don't you send me a draft of your proposal? We'll go through it, but back and forth. So very different. They help more on a hands-on basis with the proposals, and then they will let you know it's time to submit this. Whereas Department of Energy doesn't have a trustee role. They're just the hard-nosed, I'm going to be honest with you, hard-nosed, hard technology type of rigor, and that's the way their funding opportunities are written. And once you get it done once, you'll get used to the process of DOE's funding opportunity. If you had a strategic energy plan that you developed, that's an attachment that you put into that grant. So just another plug for thinking about this planning session is that once you have that document taken care of and it's bought in, that's a good document to put into, we've decided we want to go after solar panels for our community buildings, and here's the plan that was the background to say that's how we drew that conclusion. So I thought I'd share that with you today.
Thank you, Sandra. If we have no more questions, we'd like to move on to Sherry. And thank you very much, Sandra, for joining us today. Goodbye. Hi, Sherry. Floor is yours.
Hey, Charlie. And first of all, thank you to Sandra. I've never been one of her interns. I have definitely benefited from working with Sandra for about 9 years now. So one of the many who have really gained a lot from her experience. So if you have questions, most definitely, I'm going to just reiterate, reach out to Sandra. She's absolutely amazing. I'm going to jump into a little bit more on the planning side of what planning for climate change can look like with tribal communities. This is not an end-all be-all. This is just one process. And within that, there are also some links in the presentation. You're more than welcome to these slides. And I think some of the links are also popped in the chat because there's just not much we're going to cover in the amount of time that we have. Versus, as Sandra mentioned, this is usually a multi-day planning process, and particularly on climate change, it's usually multiple multi-day planning sessions. And so we're going to cover that in a little bit high level today. But if you have additional questions, follow up with me, follow up with Sandra, follow up with the MTERA crew, and we can answer those questions as well. And there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the chat as well. So I'm going to see. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Perfect. So let's see if I can make all of this work. It's only taken me 2 years of working at home to try and do this. So hopefully that changed. You can see a slide that says climate change in context. I'm going to go with yes, hopefully. So just want to put climate change in context. When we're working on climate change in our communities, like what does that mean? And ultimately, climate change is what we would call a threat multiplier. On its own, it's not necessarily a threat, but it really increases the impact of threats to communities. And a lot of that has to do with the past. So past actions, whether that's rapid development of fossil resources, that's relocation and permanent settlement of communities, shifts to modern, but really inefficient housing that might not be climate appropriate, is really driving today's challenges. And a lot of those challenges are communities threatened by erosion, threatened by a variety of climate events, high energy burdens in so many of our communities, shortages of quality housing, and really just a whole lot of issues that are more exposed by climate change because of some of those past drivers. But those realities are also fast tracking innovation. We rise to the occasion, right? And so as these climate realities become more and more felt in our communities, we're also doing things like developing appropriate housing and hybrid energy solutions. So I saw a few of you talked about like microgrids in the chat, but also increasing energy resilience, maintaining healthy indoor air quality, addressing water and sanitation issues. And so a lot of what we're trying to do in climate change planning is figure out what are those vulnerabilities and how does innovation help us address those in a contextually appropriate way. And with that, we're ultimately driving toward creating sustainable solutions. So maximizing local resources, providing local jobs, reducing energy burdens or energy bills, allowing elders to age in place because they can afford to live in their community and they have housing to live in the community and just generally supporting communities through clean energy transitions. And that can mean a lot of things. But as Sandra was just talking about, this is very community driven. This is very stakeholder driven. And so we're going to go through what that means and what that looks like. First, a few definitions, because I realize the word resilience can mean a million things. My master's thesis a little over a decade ago looked at the 108 definitions of resilience in the US federal system alone. And that was over a decade ago. There's even more today. So when we say resilience, this is typically how INRA would define resilience, which is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions, and to withstand, respond to, and recover from disruptions through adaptable and holistic planning and technical solutions. That's one definition. There are a ton of definitions. How your community chooses to define that, totally fine. A couple other quick definitions. I'm not going to read these verbatim, but when we talk about threats or hazard, that's something you can't control. That's a windstorm, that's an ice storm, that's a heat wave. Those are things that they may have human interactions, but it's not something you can directly control. A vulnerability is an inherent weakness within infrastructure or a process, within a system that can be exposed by those hazards or threats. And those can often be addressed in some ways. And I apologize, I'm getting over a cold, so just give me 1 second. Excuse me. And then risk is the potential for loss or damage or destruction from those hazards, exposing those risks. Excuse me, this cold is definitely not making this easy today. But when we start talking about an approach to climate change resilience planning, it's similar to what Sandra actually described and uses a very similar process. So first and foremost is engaging stakeholders. So this is an iterative process. We engage stakeholders at a variety of levels, but you're engaging stakeholders. We're using a lot of stakeholder data, but we're also using data. And when we say data, we mean sort of that traditional knowledge. You know, if you have folks in your communities that are saying, hey, this is how the water has changed. This is how the land has changed. This is how our food resource has changed. That is important data. But we also use Western science data. This is the change in temperature of the location. This is the difference in flooding and the probability of flooding. And so both are very important. I really want to emphasize that. Both the traditional knowledge, but also the Western science are important to this planning process. And then you can see, we'll go through this wheel a little bit more in detail, but you gather that data, you assess risks, you develop strategies to address those risks, you enact change, and then evaluate where are we now. And then you do it all over again because it is an iterative process. Let's see if I can get my slides to change. There we go. And why stakeholders? Why involve stakeholders at all? And Sandra definitely alluded to this. Goals are going to be different across communities. I grew up in a rural community in New Mexico, and the rural community goals of my county and the town that was closest to me is going to be different than a native village in Alaska, a tribe in Minnesota, you know, a tribe in Florida. They're going to be different. And so those need to be stakeholder driven goals because these need to be maintained and really pushed forward by the communities. So resilience is inherently cross-sectoral and multidimensional. It's energy, it's water, it's food, it's shelter, it's health and well-being. And so as you do the stakeholder process, largely that Sandra described, of deciding where do we want to be? What do we want to be resilient to? Why do we want to be resilient? These are some of the goals that we see most commonly. So health and well-being of the community, and that includes the cultural health of the community, the cultural well-being of the community, that includes the physical health, the mental health, all of those are important. Economic stability, economic development. We want opportunity to participate in the economic market of energy transition and climate change, or we just want more ability to participate in economic development in general. A growing one that we're seeing in more places is empowering women and youth, particularly to take leadership roles in climate change action. Access to healthy foods, often access to traditional subsistence foods that might have changed due to climate change, and then secure, reliable infrastructure. Do you have power when you need it? Do you have heat when you need it? Do you have access to roads and transportation when you need it? And so those are a lot of the goals that we typically see. Got data. Data, like I said, is super important. And this is some of the data that we're going to be asking for. If you come and say, hey, we really want help with resilience planning, what are your utility expenditures? at a tribal level, at the house level, can you give us some idea of what people are spending on their bills? What kind of infrastructure do you have? What infrastructure needs do you have? Do you have people in your tribe who aren't even connected to electricity, aren't connected to water or wastewater? What does that look like from an infrastructure perspective? What are the housing needs? Do you have a housing shortage? Do you have a shortage of housing that is climate appropriate and efficient? Those can be two different things. How long is the wait list for housing? What kind of changes have you experienced in your local environment? How has that affected the community? How have past climate events happened? What did that mean for your community having power, having food, having water? What did that mean for changes to even cultural aspects of the community? What are the locations or needs of particularly vulnerable people, and what makes them particularly vulnerable? These are questions that I can't answer on Google. These are questions we can't answer often through, research on papers. This is very stakeholder driven. This is very unique and contextual to your own tribe and your own community. Where are your most vulnerable assets? There's always like that guy in tribal housing that knows, oh, if we're going to have a power outage, those houses are going to go down first. Cool. Need to know that. That's awesome. But there's always that person in the community that tends to know that. And then we bring in things like climate change data, other hazard data, a lot of which we can pull in from other resources as well. So once we've done that, we score those hazards and threats. And there's a variety of ways to talk about hazards and threats. A lot of those, and particularly climate change, are natural. They're floods, they're storms, they're droughts, they're wildfires. Some of those are technological. Are you having infrastructure failures and you're not really sure why? It could be the age of the infrastructure or just some sort of failure in the infrastructure that we don't really know why it's happening, but it's important to know that. And then there's also human caused threats. Accidents happen. People run into telephone poles all the time. People run into transformers all the time. Something that's really growing is cyber attacks. And we are seeing these in Native communities. We're seeing particularly ransomware, where someone opens an email and suddenly your whole system is frozen and someone's demanding money. Like, this does happen. And so these are the types of threats that we typically look for and say, okay, how do we develop solutions to these? So we are looking at climate change, but we're also looking at what are some of the other threats and hazards to the community. And then we start scoring those, and scores are totally subjective. Again, stakeholders, you're going to hear me say that a ton. Stakeholders really, really matter in this process. So, we kind of use a high, medium, low type category. We have some definitions within that, but high is something that's almost certain to occur. It's historic and it's frequent, and within your planning horizon is probably going to happen. A low probability event is something that could happen in your planning horizon, but it's still pretty rare. I'll say one that's really challenging is earthquakes, because earthquakes, and we'll get to impacts here in a second, earthquakes have a low probability in any one planning horizon, and yet if they happen, they tend to have a very high impact. And so some of these are a little bit hard to try and figure out where to score these, but often it really just depends on what's your planning horizon. And then from there, we go to the vulnerabilities. And like I said, vulnerabilities are things you can often control. It doesn't mean you can completely get rid of a vulnerability, but it means there are ways to address these. So for example, if you have a lack of backup power, one way to address that would be solar and batteries, or solar batteries in the diesel system. There's ways that you can address at least part of the vulnerability. And also, you'll notice that there's links on the bottom of these, and those go to some guidebooks that better define these, even provide some worksheets to help your community or your tribe define these. Also, feel free to call or email. That totally works as well. But when we talk about vulnerability severity, it really means how bad is it if this vulnerability gets exposed. So, for example, if you have a major storm come through and every home loses electricity, that's a pretty significant consequence. If you have a storm come through and you lose power at maybe one location, one home, one store, that's a fairly low severity. Doesn't mean that home or that store is not important, but it doesn't necessarily affect the entire community. And then obviously medium is somewhere in between those. Are there extreme financial impacts? Is this going to cost a lot of money to recover? Or, do we already have the systems in place where we can recover from this without really putting additional expenditures toward it? So that's where we start going through how severe is this vulnerability if it's exposed. This chart is unreadable. That's totally on purpose, but this is how we would typically look at those. So you take that hazard score, how likely is this to happen? and that vulnerability score. How bad is it if this gets exposed? And you combine them. And so not every vulnerability is going to be exposed by every hazard. At the same time, a lot of vulnerabilities are exposed by a variety of hazards. And so we start combining those to look for what are the highest risks. So if you have, for example, a transformer in a floodplain, and that floodplain floods all the time, multiple times a year, that's probably a fairly high risk. If you have a transformer in a floodplain, but that floodplain only floods maybe once every 1,000 years, every 500 years, that's a lower risk. And so we start looking at what are the highest level risk. And there's a variety of ways that we display this and show this. But the whole goal of this is, and why we visualize it this way, is I have never met a tribe, a community, a DoD base, a country with unlimited budgets to tackle every possible risk they face. And so what we really try and do is focus in on those highest risks and how do we tackle those issues, because we do have limited budget, limited personnel, limited capacity just in general to tackle all of these things. And so on these type of charts, we're just going to be looking at those like dark red circles and saying, okay, how can we address those? Once those are addressed, you can start moving further down into those lower risk scores, but you want to tackle those ones that bring the most risk first. And from there, you're developing strategies. And this, again, stakeholders, there are technical solutions, there's well-known solutions to a lot of these. However, some things really take a lot of creativity at that local level, at that tribal level. So some of the strategies are technical solutions, doing microgrids. A lot of them are long-term planning and deciding how do budgets get allocated? How do we plan for replacing with a more resilient option rather than replacing equipment in kind? Development of regulations and policies that say this is the minimum required energy efficiency of, say, a home. Developing new programs to help people address their vulnerability and risk to climate change, and obviously capital projects, building new stuff. And that's particularly true of infrastructure vulnerabilities. And as much as that little chart is nice and clear and that's a nice little circle, all of those little bubbles within that circle of climate change planning then have these kind of subsections of how do you develop strategies. And so this is what that would look like. So you would develop strategies, but then you identify those solutions. What are potential solutions to these issues? From there, you would actually prioritize those. Which of these solutions is going to tackle the most risk or tackle the most severe risks? And if, maybe you're like, okay, some of these you don't want to do right now. So those get pushed aside for now. Maybe some like, hey, we need to analyze that more. That technology needs to mature a little bit. You push those to the side. But then once you have those prioritized solutions, you can make those into actions. Okay, we have solutions like develop microgrid. What are the process steps needed to develop microgrids? Who needs to be involved? Who needs to be in charge? How do we work with the utility? How do we work with microgrid developers? And that goes into a finalized action plan of how you implement those strategies. And so then when it comes to implementing those strategies or enacting change, then you start looking at, first and foremost, communicate it. If an engineer is telling you need to communicate, you definitely need to communicate. It is not our strong point. But how does that require funding? If it requires funding, is there internal budget for that? Is there a grant for that? Sandra just mentioned some really fantastic grants coming out of the Department of Energy Office of Indian Energy. Is there a partner that maybe could help us develop this or help us with some funding? Foundations, for example, can be great partners. Even if there's no funding required, is there political will or a political champion that's willing to push this forward, even if there's not necessarily funding required to do this? For example, a policy change doesn't necessarily require funding, but it does require a champion in the political will to do that. It also requires someone being involved who has the authority to make that change. From there, we look at how do we evaluate this program? How do we evaluate our solutions? There's different ways of quantifying resilience. I'm, again, not going to read these. They're totally on those links that I sent out. But looking at, do we reduce the outage time for our customers and community members? Do people have access to homes? Do people have access to water? Do people have access to critical services? And with that, you can also value it. How much money did our casino lose because we had a power outage? There's a number, and probably a big one. And so you can start looking at what was the cost for our community to recover from this storm, and really starting to track those costs, because that values resilience, and that also helps get the funding eventually. And from there, you look at things like, can we reduce any kind of insurance that we have? Can we reduce the payments that we're making on buildings or infrastructure? Can we take advantage of government incentives or government funding? Because you're looking at how do we quantify these solutions that we've implemented. So I'm just going to do one really quick community-led solution on this type of issue. This is Unilate Alaska, and a project that we've been working on for a while. But one of the challenges there is overcrowding and lack of adequate housing. I'm sure a lot of tribes on this call can really relate to that. And within that, there's lack of air quality, there's lack of water and sanitation, and really high energy costs. Plus, they're experiencing climate change almost three times faster than the rest of the world. And the biggest challenge was, given that housing shortage and the lack of the sanitation and bad air quality, it's really hard to keep elders in the community. And by losing elders, they're losing a lot of that traditional knowledge and a lot of the language skills that come from the elders. And so we worked with the community and to find the storage container solution where all of the pieces of a house that were really hard to build in the community. This is a fly-in only community. We're put in shipping containers. That's all of the HVAC, that's all of the water, that's the bathtub, the showers, the toilet, the kitchen. All of that was put in a shipping container. And then the house could be framed and built around it in an energy efficient way, because that also kept jobs in the community to do those type of jobs in construction, where a lot of people had those skills, but didn't necessarily have an opportunity to work in that field because it is a small community. And so the goals here, keeping elders in the community, met that goal. Getting jobs in the community through construction could meet that goal, and energy efficient and affordable housing. So we were able to meet those goals through this community-led technology solution to a climate change and really just community issues, again, on some of those past decisions to put the community in this place and to provide housing that really wasn't climate appropriate for this community. These are some links. Again, these will be all posted in the chat. You can have these slides. All of this process is totally online. You can access it. You can run through it on your own, but you can also call and we're more than happy to help. And there's my contact information. I know I ran through that super quickly, but wanted to make sure there are at least a few minutes left for question and answer. So thank you for everybody listening today, and I'd love to answer some questions.
Thank you, Sherry.
I don't see any questions in Q&A. So if anybody has questions, please let me know or throw it into the chat. Ooh, 10-hour long power outages. Those are not fun, especially if you have things like refrigeration. Depending on where you are, and I can't quite see that in my chat, there's some pretty awesome solutions. Just storage so battery storage with solar panels, but those can definitely impact outages. Also want to say, there is technical assistance available for this. Again, the Office of Indian Energy is a great place to go for that. So for how do you quantify the amount of wages lost and so on? There's a couple of ways. There actually are some tools for that. The term, if you just Google it, is value of lost load. And so you can look at time off that people weren't planning on because they couldn't go to work. You can look at how much it costs to potentially clean up or recover from that outage. To say if it was a grocery store, if they didn't have backup power, there's a good chance in 10 hours that you lost frozen food or that you lost perishable food. So quantifying not just the loss of those items, but also how many hours, how many staff hours did it take to clean up from that? That is a valuable thing to calculate. And so other things you can look at from a city perspective is how many hours it took city workers to restore power that was sort of outside of the normal scope of activities. So those are the kind of things that you would go about quantifying those losses. You could also look at, if for schools, for example, hours of lost education that have to be made up later. Those are all things that we would typically quantify. But a lot of it, again, back to that stakeholder part, is going around and asking people individually to think through it. There's not some sort of database that just automatically calculates that or some sort of tool. Like, it really is going around each individual business to schools and asking those questions. I think That's all I'm seeing, Charlie.
I agree. Well, Sherry, thank you very much. And we look forward to continue this dialogue with you in the future. Now we're going to take a 15-minute break where we encourage you to step away from the computer, grab a cup of coffee or answer some emails. And before doing so, we ask you to take a few minutes to complete a survey that'll be showing up on your screen. And lastly, please head back to the event website and go to the event hub to join our next program at 12:30. Miigwech, thank you.